Hello, this is going to be a new series, I think. It depends on the reception, I suppose, so let me know what you think of this exactly. But there was quite a few people that were asking me if I'm just going to do some videos where I just talk and, well, without a guest, that is. Obviously, pretty much all the videos I do, I'm talking in some capacity, but, just by myself. And I think this is, coming from some of what I would classify as, I suppose, my core audience. People who, sort of watch some of my more original content when I initially started my YouTube channel, which... my brand was always, or my focus was always on content that was illuminating from the perspective of that journey from amateur to professional and that sort of self-development type aspect where we're looking at how can we have the most effective and efficient practices from sort of every facet to be better people, be better players. The things are linked really in many respects. So, and it's also quite accessible to everybody, I would say, I believe. So that's the reason why I'm thinking of doing this, and for a lot of people as well, they probably don't know really anything about my origins with esports, kind of what it means to me. And esports really saved my life in many respects because I didn't have the easiest time growing up. I moved around a lot of familial strife and money problems, and I was bullied a lot and moved around different schools. Like, it wasn't an easy time, and so the sort of marriage between video games and competition, two things I was very passionate about, was an obvious choice for me, and it ended up turning out to be an amazing platform for self-development and self-worth as well, because I didn't really have anything going on, again, like, it was just stress everywhere. And so for me to be able to sort of disappear into esports, essentially, I was able to work really hard at something, and I saw the skill, and I got the reward back from generating the skill from hours put into the discipline, and I also got self-worth back from the respect of my peers who also understood exactly the kind of work it takes to accumulate that level of skill, and that that mutual respect of the other competitors that you're facing up against as well. That was such an important part of my development, and I came across so many different life lessons along the way, and that's that was where a lot of that content used to come from for me, because I wanted to share those lessons with people. And so this is going to be great, because with this series I think I can recycle some of the other older ideas that I maybe recorded years ago even, and just sort of put them into this format now that I'm a bit older, a bit more mature, a bit better of a thinker, and a bit better at articulating things. So this video, it seems to make sense to me, with some of the material I'm reading lately as well, that I just talk about thinking, because everything really pertains to thinking. Everything that all the conclusions that I've come to is based on my philosophies, the way that I think. So what are the three, I want to kind of cover in this podcast the three types of thinking practices that I think are the most important, or the ones that spring to my mind first. And they're big areas, but I think it's worth covering, and I want to do so succinctly. So let's see if I can do that. That's the challenge. And at the end of sort of talking about those three things, I want to also talk to you guys about what I think is one of the most flawed but common thinking practices that exists in esports in particular, in competition in particular, and generally, actually, to be honest, in life as well. So we're going to get to that, but first of all, the three. Let's start with so I'll be going over critical thinking, skepticism, and intellectual honesty. Like, these will be the three things I'll cover here. So let's start with critical thinking. So, of course, thinking is incredibly important, and critical thinking is, somewhat of a buzzword, honestly. It seems to be that way. Obviously, it sounds good. It seems like something that you should do, and, there's courses on it these days and all that kind of stuff. But what is it? Really, when we're thinking about critical thinking, it's the ability to analyze things. It's the ability to take information and to have tools to dissect that information to then generate insights. And so that's can be difficult, because where do you get those tools from? Like, what are the tools? That's really the hard question, and I think it's very difficult to, it seems like somewhat ambiguous, because when you take data in, you just kind of like you just have a thought, you just have an insight that just sort of pops up, and that's sort of based on all of the other information that you've received in the past. So from that perspective, the tools can be a lot of things. Like, for example, let's say if we want to use Counter-Strike as an example, a tool for analysis in Counter-Strike is, sitting down and watching a demo. And you're every time you watch a demo, you're learning to think in different ways. And so, generally speaking, everything that we do in life, we're looking to move towards the good, and we're looking to move away from the bad. This is like a very easy way to sort of break that down. Like if we like everything sort of is sort of branched underneath that, right? I think that makes sense. So from that perspective, when you sit down and you're starting to like try to figure out, what are your tools to create some analysis, you have to think about, okay, what is good? Okay, we know that if you stand in the open with an AWP, that's probably pretty bad. That's pretty bad. You don't have anywhere to cover, any way to sort of escape the fight. We know that escape options are important. We know that the AWP has a reload time, so that's also another reason why cover is useful. Also, we know that it's better longer range than closer range. We know that there are certain specific angles that make shots easier or harder. And let's say in the meta game, there's some positions that are more expected or going to be more commonly flashed off, and so on and so forth. Like so these are things that you would notice by watching demos. So now, if you take into account some of these basic bits of theory that we've now pieced together, we can understand, okay, so now it's a bit easier to understand and gain insights on a position that an AWP takes and whether or not that's going to be good. So that's some critical thinking there for you, because you're able to look at a situation and you're able to see a bunch of different options, and using the sort of theoretical model that you've constructed based on what you know to be sort of consistent with Counter-Strike, you can now have an insight. So, this is like a, basic way to look at some critical thinking. And it's really important because whenever you see something, you need to be thinking, is this good or is this bad? Or what are the arguments for this and what are the arguments against this? And this is a process that you want to be actively engaging in all the time. And the more you do this, the better you will get at it. And generally speaking, what we tend to be doing, and this is sort of how I think about it, is that we're always creating models for thoughts. So you can think of a model like a computer system in some regard, whereby you put data in and information comes out. This is kind of like the basic thing here. And so when you like, data is just it's not meaningless. It just has not been given meaning yet. So like I think the way that this is talked about in the computer sciencey world is that you have data, you put it in to a model, and it comes out as information. Information is data with insight, basically. So it's data given meaning, data given context. So that's what's happening here. So with all the rules that I just stated for an AWPer, that is sort of like we're developing our model of how we understand like what are the good things in Counter-Strike. So that's what that is. And so you build that over time. Like you build that by saying, okay, we understand these things are good, these things are bad, and eventually you have this model. And now every time you look at a game of Counter-Strike, you're like, okay, this is good and this is bad. So the only other thing there is that you have to constantly also question whether things sort of fit into your model or not. This is really the issue, because you can be lazy here, and I've done this in the past too, where I'll have a model that I've constructed, but there will be some data that I'll get, and I'll be like, well, this seems like it kind of should maybe fit in the model, but it doesn't really. So, but I don't know what to do with it. And there'll be other spots where you'll get some data, and you'll be like, well, this doesn't really fit in my model, and it's actually really, in fact, it's really far outside of it. Like it's super far away, and so there it's easier to discard that as maybe just noise. But not always. It might be that you have to evolve and change your model over time. Well, it will be the case that you'll have to change and evolve it over time. But the way to do so is by constant questioning and constantly engaging with what you know about the game, and trying to think what are the good and bad arguments for this. And that's generally what critical thinking is going to be. It's about just dissecting everything and trying to understand what the good and the bad is. And that's another thing. Like you have to also determine like what are the goals, because obviously like the good thing, what is a good thing? A good thing is going to be separated into the different goals, and how do you prioritize each goal. So now we're starting to understand the things that are valuable, and now you know what is valuable. You can understand how far does this thing move me towards that thing that is valuable. And so the process just continues like this. So the next thing is skepticism, and I think skepticism is incredibly important, because skepticism is, first and foremost, it is the path of most resistance, and the path of least resistance, rarely is going to be very good for us. But the thing is that it's sort of this just evolutionary fact, in a sense, that the conservation of energy, it's very important. If you leave something in a state for long enough, it's just going to, by itself, it will usually revert to the most energy efficient state. This is just sort of something that happens, and it's like, for example, why our bodies are resistant to putting on muscle. If you put on muscle, you're increasing the metabolic demand of your body. That is no small task. That's going to have a survival impact, because now you need to hunt and gather more food. So, you're going to have way more risk involved in that process. So generally speaking, like it just is what it is. That's how human beings are. We tend to, when there's effort involved in something, if there's not like a counteractive incentive of extreme amounts of pleasure or fun that's instantly gratifying for the instant, like as an instant response to the effort we're putting in that moment, sometimes it's going to feel very tough. This is why, some activities, like let's say getting a degree is going to be more taxing than playing a video game. That's in a way, like in a competitive way, in a sense, because you're getting some rewards. There's some reward systems in video games which will, even if it's a very hardcore competitive game like Counter-Strike, that's very sort of very basic and it's like very no frills, but very satisfying in its basics. It does give you enough that you can consistently, like, oh, I hit that decoy headshot, that just feels good. It feels good to exert my skill on the game. Like, it just feels good to do that. It's just fun. And so you have like these fun incentives. And there are things that, like, just reading pages in a book, that's, there's not so many instantly gratifying fun incentives doing that. When you're working out at the gym, you have a lot of instantly satisfying incentives where, like, you get the pump, you get the endorphin rush. It's really encouraging, week in, week out, quite a short time frame, you see improvements, and that's rewarding as well. So, there's this counter system of incentives there that are pretty instantly, you're instantly able to realize. And that's another thing we know about human beings is, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, we are terrible at looking into the future. We're terrible at doing it. It's very difficult for us to imagine, us like doing something that's difficult, that's new for 3 months, and thinking about, in 3 months, this might be a huge payoff. Like, it's very hard to see that payoff. You just have to have the faith, and that's very difficult to do. So anyway, talking about skepticism here, I went on to a bit of a side note there about the path of least resistance. So, but that's something to think about too. You have to think about, am I being resistant to this thing that I sort of want to do? In the back of my mind, do I objectively understand that I should do this thing? But the reason why I'm not doing it is because, emotionally there might be an issue, that's difficult, that's negative, and so that's creating resistance. Or is it like an extreme amount of effort? Is that creating resistance? And is this something that I should push through? Would I get a great result if I push through this? So that's another reason why you have to be very aware of your own thoughts in that sense. But skepticism is really important because it is it is the path of most resistance, because you have to question everything, and you're questioning things in a realm where you don't have the information. It's critical thinking is great, but sometimes you just don't have the info. Like, we use the examples of Counter-Strike where the goal is very clear, and the reality of Counter-Strike and the rules of Counter-Strike are very clear. But skepticism is more useful and actively important when you're in a spot where things are not clear. Like, let's look at the fitness industry, for example. We're all very emotionally invested in our own body image. We're very invested in our health, and the fitness industry is booming right now. The thing is though, we have all these experts all over the place who are very incentivized by money and so on and so forth, by to sell their ideas. And even if they aren't selling their ideas, you just have a guy that looks fit telling you that this works. You're going to be sort of thinking, okay, well, I guess he's fit, so he must know, right? But obviously that's not necessarily the case. You get a more extreme example of this. Like, I've actually read some books. Like I've read one of the books of, like, the Keto Guy, for example. And when I was reading the book, I'm like, I'm really sensing a huge degree of expert bias in this book. I'm seeing this guy who definitely understands some stuff about human biology. And by the way, of course, the reason why this is so difficult is because we know so little about nutrition science and exercise science at the moment. They're very, very new sciences. The sciences that we really understand by far the least. Incredibly complex, incredibly unique systems at play here. So the one system catch-all answer is obviously not going to make sense. Would the same chair, that's designed for a 5'6" person, work for everyone in the planet? Well, we're not all 5'6", and that's an incredibly rudimentary basic. But the variance between height and size and shape is so enormous, and that's very basic, and in comparison to the human biology, where there's an enormously large amount of factors that can differentiate human beings. So you're in this crazy minefield where it's very difficult to even understand what the reality is, unlike versus the Counter-Strike example that I just used when we were talking about critical thinking. So this is where skepticism is really important, because you have to in all of this uncertainty, you have to actually try to find out whether you're being sold a lie. So how do you do that? Well, you do have to apply critical thinking. You do have to question the sources. You do have to do a lot of research, and it is really tough. And what I would say for anyone who is actually experiencing those woes in the fitness industry, I would say just look at what are the most basic things that we understand that are the most provable. And what is the science, like what is the most consistent things that we know about the science right now? So yes, I would say, practicing skepticism, incredibly important. A lot of experts very invested in, from a self-worth perspective, because it's their life, their identity to be an expert in that industry. They're making their money that way. They have a bias. We all have cognitive biases, and you have to really, if you're ever listening to someone talk about an idea, you have to understand what cognitive biases may they have or may they not have, that could impact their opinion here on this particular subject. You've got to be curious about that, because everyone's got some kind of a bias about something. I could go on with a lot of different examples, but I shall move forward. So I want this to be a snappy one. I want it to be snappy because I don't want to bore you guys, and I want to see if this is the kind of thing that you guys would actually want more of in the future. So moving on, intellectual honesty, another really, really important one. I want to talk about two separate topics within this one, and then quickly move forwards. So one of the big things with intellectual honesty is this is just the idea that you're being sort of, I think it's really in the title, honestly. I came up with this term myself, and then later realized that a lot of people use this, and a lot of different scholars and so on, and philosophers actually use this term as well. And I think it is just because it's very self-evident. Are you actually, like, when you come upon an analysis of something, are you actually being intellectually honest? And so that means, are you actually very sure that where your insight and your analysis, your conclusion of your analysis, did it come from a place where you looked at the data and you were sort of objective about it? Or are you being influenced in some way, whether it be a cognitive bias or whether it be emotionally or otherwise? So, for example, one of the biggest ones that's a horrible problem for human beings is rationalization. Rationalization is whenever we emotionally are influenced by whatever, like the example I used for critical thinking. Skepticism. I forget now. But either way, I was mentioning an emotional influence here. So, for example, I said that there might be, maybe there's like a problem in your relationship, or maybe there's something that makes you feel negative, whatever reason. That's going to create some resistance to you making potentially like the right call, the objective choice, or for example, in Buddhism, and they actually call this they actually call it the emotion. They actually call resistance an emotion that you experience, because in Buddhism, they're saying, you objectively understand what is the right course of action, but, there's an emotion of resistance. It's like anxiety, it's a stress, for whatever it might be. It's creating a spot where you're less likely to want to do it. So then what happens is your mind rationalizes, it sort of changes how you perceive something to sort of match up with, the emotional outcome, so that you feel more comfortable. Basically, it's trying your mind's basically, it's like a defense mechanism to make you feel more comfortable to do something. So you got to be really careful about rationalization. Always question: are you rationalizing something, or am I actually being intellectually honest? I hope I explained that one okay. Let me know. So the other one is that I think happens all the time is an epistemological error. I think where people just say it makes sense. So that term, I've used it a lot of times, and afterwards now I'm like, as many times after which I'm thinking to myself, does it make sense? Why does it make sense? Why would that actually make sense? And could I even say that if I couldn't even come up with that conclusion in the first place? This seems to be an issue. So and so, for example, like I always use I always bring up quantum physics in this one, because for those of you that are familiar with that area, or Richard Feynman, the late Richard Feynman, who is a personal hero of mine, I believe it was a quote from him where, he was one of the people that made, some great leaps and bounds in the field of quantum electrodynamics. In fact, that's his thing. And in the quantum world, all the laws of physics that we understand and can observe in our current sort of, before we go into the quantum world, it just defies everything in the non-quantum world. Basically, all the rules are just completely ridiculous. And so we had to create a whole new set of rules that were completely unintuitive to the extreme, based on what we know. And what is intuition? What is intuitive? Intuitive is something that we just intrinsically understand. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from, all of the different things that we've experienced up until this point. We generate sort of standards and we look for the consistencies there and the patterns, and there's clear patterns in how we observe nature around us and reality around us. But when you go into the quantum world, everything's completely fucking weird and doesn't follow any of that. So the quote is, the universe has no obligation to make sense to you. And I think that's a really critical one, because ultimately I think that's very true. The universe, it just does what it does. Like, I think it can be arrogant to a degree and intellectually lazy to just think that something should follow just because because you think that it should because of your previous experiences. I mean, generally speaking, things will. But I think that it's always worth questioning that. And I think that you're kind of cheating yourself sometimes to just say, oh, that makes sense, and not to sort of question it a little bit more. So that's like a term that I've been sort of catching myself much more in recently. And if we were to quickly move forwards, I'm trying to make this super snappy, my God. This is much more succinct than I'm used to. To move forwards and to sort of relate this more into esports once again, one of the most flawed and sort of bad thinking habits I think that there is in esports is outcome orientedness. And there's sort of a paradoxical nature here, because let's say any young player, to be honest, in any team game, team esports specifically, if you're trying to come up, the only way you're going to get noticed is if you have really good sort of mechanics, if you have really good aim, if you frag a lot. And so your metric of understanding how well you are doing or not is based upon that metric of how well you frag. And so that is then how you get up there, because if you're a really good team but with really bad individuals, you're going to get wrecked by a team of a really bad team of great individuals. That's just kind of how it goes. So you're going to spend your time getting noticed by just focusing on your individual skill ultimately, and you won't really have experienced proper team Counter-Strike just yet at a good level. So you're going to not have, you won't really have developed a lot of the theory and the thinking tools necessary to develop those areas. And we see this very commonly, and this is kind of the paradox of it. And it's just part of the nature of it, really. So it's kind of an issue, because it kind of goes back to the sort of it makes sense sort of thing, because you're effectively saying that you're just agreeing with the conclusion and you're not really agreeing with like the working, because if you understood the working, then you could easily get to the conclusion, right, in the it makes sense sort of sentence. So from that perspective, you have the same problem, whereby you're just skipping all of the analysis. You're just saying, well, obviously I'm going to be judging my analysis based on the outcome. I'm not going to be judging my analysis based on anything else. And so if we look at the examples I use in the critical thinking, where I was listing certain things that we know about the AWP, like some very basic things, the reload, the ranges, this, that, and the other, wanting to be around cover because of those other factors, then all of a sudden, like if you have a player like Simple, who's like super, super, super good, and you watch his demos and maybe he's doing like crazy stuff with the AWP, you may think, oh, because he's standing in this ridiculous place, which actually is a terrible spot, but still kills everyone, that is, a good decision that he was there because he got the outcome that you think that you value. But in reality, there's not as simple as that, no pun intended. And so in that sense, it's a very bad thinking sort of methodology to just jump to the outcome. And instead you want to, if you're acting in a field like Counter-Strike, or just generally anything in life where there's a lot of uncertainties and a lot of outcomes which you can't quantify exactly, and instead you're using sort of percentages, let's say, and not even really in Counter-Strike, we don't really have the analytical tools for that just yet to parse extreme amounts of data in a complex way. Poker is a good example, because in poker, obviously, they have, you have the hands, so you can just work out the odds. You can calculate odds very easily, but it's very difficult in Counter-Strike. But generally, things will be like that. So you need to understand how to make high percentage plays, and how do you get to that point? How do you understand what is a high expected value play? Well, you have to have a good theory of the game, and from that, you can maybe extrapolate what a high percentage play might be. And so there you go. That was a really, really fast jaunt around critical thinking, skepticism, intellectual honesty, and why outcome-orientedness is a bad thinking methodology. And I think I'll leave it here and see what you guys think. That was, god damn, that was fast. I'm not used to this. If you guys enjoyed that, please let me know. I would love some feedback on this one, whether this is something you'd like to see more of, just me talking about various topics which pertain to esports, and ones which sort of are a little bit more meta, a lot like this one. And also, if you have any suggestions for any sort of topics that I should be covering on a podcast like this, I'd absolutely love to hear it. Obviously, I can't commit to doing every single idea, but having those ideas out there really serves to sort of inspire and sort of lead me in directions, certain directions, if I'm sort of ever sort of stuck. And I don't think I had a worry that maybe I would struggle to put content out there, but I don't have so much of a worry there anymore. So I'm pretty confident that I can continue to sort of pump these out in general. So looking forward to doing that and sort of developing my skills as a podcast host and as someone sort of who speaks in this format. I think there's a lot of growth for me to do with it, and I'm really excited to undertake that journey. And yeah, just really excited about it, really, to be honest. So hashtag AskDDK is going to be a way for you guys to ask me smaller questions. And this is another sort of experiment that I want to run, whereby I create more segmentation to the shows to sort of provide a bit, just break it up a little bit, create more diversity, make it a bit more engaging. And I think that would be a lot of fun. So that's a good way for me to organize those. So on Twitter, hashtag AskDDK, and I'll collect some of those questions, and I'll sort of do a 5 to 10 minute sort of answer session before the next big podcast if I have enough questions from you guys. And on YouTube, that can be where you sort of suggest topics. I think it's a bit easier to sort of organize it in that way. So, and that's pretty much it for now, I would say. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you got some value from it. Ciao for now.